I came home a billionaire as the HOA dragged my father out. By sunset, she was done. How does someone come home to a moment like that? What could possibly unfold between that shocking beginning and the promise hidden in those final words? If stories of justice, impossible turnarounds, and unforgettable showdowns are your kind of ride, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Before we begin, tell me this. What would you do if you came home to the situation described in that title? Now, let me take you back to the exact moment when everything started, because nothing about that day unfolded the way anyone could have expected. The people who smile while taking your home almost never expect someone to come back. The first thing I noticed when my jet touched down wasn't the bright Florida sun pouring across the runway or the familiar scent of hot asphalt drifting through the open cabin door. It was my phone vibrating so hard across the leather armrest that it nearly slid onto the floor. 3 missed calls, 11 text messages, then a video. I tapped the screen before I even stepped onto the stairs, and suddenly the noise of the airport disappeared behind a single recording that stole every ounce of air from my lungs. The camera shook as neighbors gathered along the sidewalk in front of the only house that had ever truly felt like home. My father, William Carter, stood quietly on the front porch he had built with his own hands more than 40 years earlier. The weathered cedar rail still carried the faded marks where I had carved my initials as a kid, and the old brass mailbox leaned at the same crooked angle it always had after one unforgettable hurricane season. Standing several feet away was a woman dressed in an immaculate white blazer, holding a clipboard as if it carried more authority than simple decency. Vanessa Whitmore, president of the Homeowners Association. Even through a phone screen, her confident posture made it obvious she believed the neighborhood belonged to her. My father never raised his voice. He simply rested one hand on the porch railing while speaking with the calm patience that had defined him my entire life. Around him, phones were lifted into the air, recording every second. No one stepped forward. No one asked if he was all right. They simply watched. I checked the timestamp. The recording had started less than 18 minutes earlier. That meant I was less than 20 minutes away from the house where every lesson about honesty, hard work, and keeping your word had been taught to me by the man standing alone on that porch. 7 years. That was how long I had been gone building a company that eventually grew beyond anything either of us had imagined. During every late night, every impossible meeting, every sleepless flight across the country, Dad always ended our calls the same way. Don't worry about me. Just come home when you can. I had promised I would. Looking at that screen, I realized I had already waited far too long. I grabbed my jacket before the engines had fully powered down, ignored the driver waiting beside the terminal entrance, and headed straight for the parking area. Every minute suddenly mattered. Every traffic light felt too slow. Every mile stretched longer than it should have. I didn't know every detail of what had happened, and I wasn't interested in guessing. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Before the sun disappeared below the horizon, someone was going to discover that they had made the biggest mistake of their life by underestimating the Carter family. The highway leading into Oak Ridge Estates looked exactly the way I remembered it. Yet somehow, everything felt smaller than the memories I had carried for years. The towering live oaks still stretched over the road, their branches forming a green tunnel that had once seemed endless when I rode my bicycle beneath them as a 12-year-old boy. The same corner diner still displayed a faded neon sign promising the best pie in the county. Even the old gas station across the intersection had not changed its peeling blue paint. Time had left its fingerprints everywhere except inside my memories, where every detail remained untouched. As I drove, I found myself thinking less about the company I had built and more about the man waiting at the end of this road. My father had never cared about headlines, stock prices, or business magazines. When reporters called me a billionaire after the sale of my technology company, he laughed and asked whether I was still remembering to eat breakfast. That was William Carter. He measured success by promises kept instead of numbers on a screen. He had spent nearly 40 years restoring homes throughout our county, believing every family deserved a place where they felt safe walking through the front door. After my mother passed away, that old house became more than a building. It became the last place where every photograph, every holiday decoration, every handwritten recipe, and every quiet conversation still connected us to her. My father refused every offer to sell, even after developers began buying neighboring properties one by one. He always smiled and said the same thing. Some things have value that cannot be measured with money. At the time, I thought he was simply being sentimental. Looking back, I realized he understood something I had forgotten while chasing success across boardrooms and airports. Home is not where you store your belongings. Home is where your story begins. My navigation announced that I was less than 3 miles away. Another message appeared on my phone. This time it was from our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, who had known me since elementary school. She had only written 8 words. Please hurry. Your father is staying calm, but they are not. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel without taking my eyes off the road. I could already picture the front porch with its cedar planks weathered silver by decades of Florida summers, the old brass mailbox that leaned slightly after every storm, and the massive oak tree my father planted the year I was born. Every one of those details had been part of my childhood, and every one of them had appeared in the video I had just watched. None of them belonged in a public spectacle. As I turned onto Carter Lane, I noticed more vehicles parked along the street than I had ever seen before. Curtains shifted behind windows. People stood quietly on sidewalks pretending not to stare. Whatever had happened had spread through the neighborhood faster than any official notice ever could. One thing became painfully clear before I even reached the driveway. This was never just about a house. Someone had decided to test the dignity of the one man who had spent his entire life treating everyone else with respect, and they had no idea that the story they believed they were controlling was only beginning. By the time I pulled onto my father's street, the neighborhood had fallen into the kind of silence that only appears after something uncomfortable has already happened. Nobody was mowing their lawn anymore. Nobody was walking a dog. They were watching from porches, behind curtains, or beside neatly trimmed hedges, pretending they had somewhere else to look. I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway. I wanted to understand the situation before anyone noticed I had arrived. My father's old pickup truck still sat beside the garage exactly where it always had, its faded blue paint reflecting the afternoon sun. The wooden porch swing moved gently in the breeze, and the brass mailbox leaned at the same familiar angle. Nothing about the property suggested neglect. Everything looked cared for with the same quiet pride my father had always taken in his home. Then my eyes settled on the woman standing near the walkway. Vanessa Whitmore held another clipboard tucked neatly against her side while speaking to 2 members of the HOA board. She looked polished from head to toe, dressed in expensive clothes that matched the luxury vehicles parked nearby. Even from a distance, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every decision she made would go unquestioned. She pointed toward the front porch while another board member nodded and scribbled notes. Their expressions never changed. There was no anger. There was no excitement. Only the cold efficiency of people convinced they were acting with complete authority. I recognized one of the men beside her. Daniel Pierce had lived 3 streets over for nearly 15 years. He used to wave at my father every Saturday morning while walking his golden retriever. Now he avoided making eye contact altogether. It was amazing how quickly ordinary people could become comfortable standing beside power instead of standing beside principle. I stepped out of my vehicle and closed the door quietly. The sound finally caught Vanessa's attention. She looked in my direction for only a second before returning to her conversation, dismissing me with the same casual glance someone might give a delivery driver. She clearly had no idea who I was. To her, I was simply another person arriving too late to change anything. My father noticed me first. Even from across the yard, he managed a small smile that somehow carried more reassurance than concern. He lifted one hand just enough for me to see before placing it back against the porch railing. That simple gesture said everything. Stay calm. Do not make this worse. It was exactly what I expected from him. He had spent my entire life teaching me that character is revealed when emotions are tested. Vanessa finally walked toward me with measured confidence, stopping several feet away as though she had rehearsed this conversation many times before. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. I looked past her toward my father, then back at the clipboard she held so carefully. Every page inside that folder suddenly seemed far more important than she realized. Without raising my voice or showing the frustration building inside me, I answered with complete honesty. I certainly hope so. For the first time that afternoon, the balance of the story began to shift, even though nobody standing on that quiet street understood it yet. Vanessa glanced down at her clipboard before looking back at me, as though whatever answer she was about to give had already been approved long before I arrived. If you are here about Mr. Carter, she said in an even tone, the association has already completed its review, and the board has acted according to the governing documents. She spoke with the polished confidence of someone who had repeated the same explanation countless times. I nodded once without interrupting her. Years of negotiating billion-dollar contracts had taught me that people often revealed far more when they believed they were completely in control. What review? I asked. She opened the folder and turned it slightly toward me, careful not to let me hold it. I caught a glimpse of several printed notices, highlighted paragraphs, and what appeared to be a timeline of alleged violations. The pages looked organized, official, and convincing at first glance. My father quietly stepped down from the porch and stopped beside me. His work boots were still dusted with sawdust from the small woodworking projects he spent his mornings building in the garage. He rested one hand lightly against the old cedar railing, the same railing he had repaired every spring without fail. Son, he said calmly, do not worry about me. Everything will work itself out. That was exactly what he would say, even if he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Before I could answer, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks slowly walked across her front lawn. She held a folded envelope in both hands, glancing nervously toward the HOA board before stopping a few feet away. William, she said softly, I think he should know. She handed me the envelope. Inside were copies of notices that had been delivered over the past several months. One cited the height of the grass. Another mentioned the color of the mailbox. Another questioned the condition of the porch railing that my father had personally restored only weeks earlier. Individually, each notice seemed minor. Together, they formed a relentless pattern. Every few days another letter, another deadline, another warning, another fee. I looked up at my father. Why did you never tell me? He smiled the same quiet smile that had carried me through every disappointment as a child. Because you were building your future, he replied. I did not want you flying home over paperwork. I lowered my eyes to the documents once more. Something immediately caught my attention. The dates. The sequence was unusually aggressive, with multiple notices issued before the response period for previous ones had even expired. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to make me ask better questions. Vanessa noticed exactly where my attention had settled. Everything has been handled. According to procedure, she said quickly. The board voted unanimously. I folded the papers carefully instead of arguing. Across the street, I noticed several neighbors quietly recording the conversation with their phones. Earlier, that would have made me uncomfortable. Now it meant something entirely different. Every word spoken from this point forward would have witnesses. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket beside my phone, where the earlier video still waited. The old brass mailbox, the weathered porch, the cedar railing, the quiet dignity on my father's face. And now these carefully dated notices all fit together like pieces of a puzzle that nobody else seemed interested in assembling. I looked directly at Vanessa and asked the only question that mattered. May I have a complete copy of every document the board relied on before making its decision? Vanessa did not answer my question right away. Instead, she offered the kind of practiced smile that looked pleasant until you noticed it never reached her eyes. Those records are available through the association's formal request process, she said. You may submit the appropriate paperwork during normal business hours. I almost smiled back. I had heard versions of that sentence in boardrooms all over the country whenever someone wanted to delay the truth without technically refusing it. That sounds reasonable, I replied calmly. Then I will submit the request immediately. Her expression changed ever so slightly. She had expected resistance. She had expected emotion. She had expected me to argue in front of the neighbors. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and began taking photographs of every notice my father had received. One by one, front and back, dates, signatures, reference numbers. Nothing dramatic, just careful documentation. Across the yard, I noticed several neighbors lowering their phones. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. The conversation was no longer about accusations. It was becoming about records. My father quietly watched without saying a word. He knew that when I became unusually calm, I was already thinking several steps ahead. Mrs. Brooks looked relieved for the first time since I had arrived. I kept copies because something never felt right, she admitted softly. The notices started coming faster every month. I nodded gratefully before organizing the papers in chronological order across the hood of my rental vehicle. A pattern emerged almost immediately. Inspection. Warning. Fine. Additional warning. Hearing notice. Another inspection. The intervals between them became shorter and shorter until they almost overlapped. It looked less like ordinary enforcement and more like someone trying to build momentum toward a predetermined conclusion. I still did not have enough information to accuse anyone of anything, but experience had taught me that unusual timelines deserved closer examination. I opened my email and forwarded every photograph to my attorney, Rebecca Lawson, who had represented me for nearly a decade. My message contained only one sentence. Please review these immediately and tell me what questions I should be asking before sunset. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone rang. Ethan, Rebecca said without wasting a second, do not argue with anyone. Request every governing document, every meeting minute, every violation report, and every communication related to your father's property. If they refuse, make note of exactly who refused and when. That was precisely the advice I had hoped to hear. Facts before conclusions. Documents before opinions. I thanked her and ended the call. Vanessa had been watching the entire conversation from only a few yards away. Is there anything else? She asked, sounding more cautious than confident now. I slipped my phone back into my jacket beside the envelope Mrs. Brooks had given me. The old brass mailbox caught the afternoon sunlight. The cedar porch railing cast long shadows across the front steps, and the massive oak tree rustled quietly overhead as though it had witnessed decades of stories without ever revealing a single one. I looked directly at Vanessa and spoke as evenly as my father always had. Yes, I said. I would also like the names of every board member who voted on this matter, copies of the meeting minutes, and the complete record, showing how each decision was reached. For the first time since I had stepped onto that street, nobody said a single word. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with the other board members before answering. It lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for me to notice. People who know they are standing on solid ground rarely need silent confirmation from anyone else. The association will respond through the proper channels, she said, carefully emphasizing every word. We have procedures for these requests. I nodded politely. Good, I replied. I appreciate organizations that follow procedures. She seemed satisfied with that answer, assuming the conversation had reached its conclusion. It had not. I walked over to my father and sat beside him on the old cedar porch swing. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to slow down. The familiar scent of freshly cut pine drifted from the open garage where unfinished birdhouses still rested on his workbench. A worn claw hammer lay exactly where he had always left it after finishing a project. Even after all these years, nothing inside that garage had been arranged for appearance. Every tool had earned its place through decades of honest work. My father looked toward the street instead of at me. You know, he said quietly, they started asking about the property almost 2 years ago. At first they were friendly. Then they became persistent. After I declined their suggestions, the letters became more frequent. I listened without interrupting. Did anyone ever offer to buy the house? I asked. He smiled faintly. Not directly. They always called it an opportunity. That single word stayed with me. Opportunity. I had heard it used countless times in corporate negotiations whenever someone wanted another person's assets without appearing aggressive. Across the street, a black sport utility vehicle slowly rolled past before continuing around the corner. The driver looked toward our house just long enough to make it obvious that curiosity had spread well beyond the neighborhood. Mrs. Brooks quietly stepped onto the porch carrying a small cardboard box. William asked me to keep these, she explained. Inside were neatly organized folders containing every letter, envelope, receipt, and certified mail confirmation he had received from the association. My father had documented everything. Every envelope still carried its original postmark. Every notice had been dated in his careful handwriting. Every certified delivery receipt remained attached with the same small paper clips he had used for decades. I looked through the stack one document at a time. The dates confirmed the pattern I had already suspected. The frequency increased immediately after several nearby homes changed ownership. Coincidence was possible, but experience had taught me never to ignore timing. My phone vibrated again. Rebecca Lawson had already reviewed the photographs I sent earlier. Her message contained only one sentence. Ask the county recorder for every publicly filed document connected to this property during the past 24 months. I smiled for the first time that day. Public records. They did not rely on opinions. They did not depend on memory. They simply existed. I stood, slipped the folders carefully back into the box, and thanked Mrs. Brooks for preserving every piece of paper. Then I looked once more at the weathered brass mailbox, the cedar railing, the old oak tree, and the quiet house that had shaped my entire life. Someone had clearly invested months building a paper trail around this property. They probably believed nobody would ever take the time to read every page. They were about to discover that patience had always been my greatest advantage, and this story was no longer being written by assumptions. It was about to be written by evidence. The county recorder's office closed in less than 2 hours, and for the first time that afternoon, I felt as though the clock mattered just as much as the documents. I told my father I would be back before dinner. He simply nodded, reached into his pocket, and handed me the old brass key to the front door. "Take it," he said. "You always kept this place alive, even when you were far away." The key felt heavier than I remembered. As a teenager, I had carried it everywhere. Now it reminded me that some responsibilities never disappeared, no matter how many miles separated you from home. I drove straight to the county administration building while Rebecca remained on speakerphone. She already had 2 members of her legal team searching public databases from her office in Tampa. "Do not focus only on the HOA," she advised. "Look for property transfers, easements, development applications, zoning requests, and any recently recorded agreements involving neighboring lots." Her thinking matched my own. If someone had invested nearly 2 years building pressure against my father's property, there was almost certainly a larger objective waiting beneath the surface. 20 minutes later, I walked through the glass doors of the recorder's office. The quiet hum of printers and fluorescent lights replaced the tension of the neighborhood. A clerk named Susan greeted me with a polite smile and asked how she could help. I explained that I wanted every publicly recorded document connected to my father's parcel and the surrounding properties during the previous 24 months. She looked at the address, typed for several moments, and then paused. "There are quite a few filings," she said. "Would you like everything?" "Everything," I answered. She disappeared into the records room while I continued reviewing the timeline my father had preserved so carefully. Rebecca called again, just as Susan returned carrying a thick stack of printed records secured with a large binder clip. "Interesting development," Rebecca said. "One of the companies purchasing nearby homes has the same registered business address as a consulting firm that recently advised the Homeowners Association on neighborhood redevelopment." I stopped turning pages. "Is that unusual?" I asked. "Not necessarily," she replied. "But it creates questions worth asking, especially if board decisions affected property values or future development plans." I thanked her and continued reading. Survey maps, boundary adjustments, permit applications, public meeting notices. None of them proved misconduct on their own. Then I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. A proposed infrastructure improvement map showed a future entrance road running remarkably close to my father's lot. If the surrounding parcels were assembled into one continuous project, his property occupied one of the most strategically valuable positions on the entire plan. Suddenly, the repeated offers, the growing number of notices, and the increasing pressure no longer appeared isolated. They fit into a much larger picture. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant filing and scanned each page into secure cloud storage. Nothing would depend upon a single paper copy. As I carried the records back to my vehicle, the afternoon sun had already begun sinking lower across the parking lot. I looked at the thick binder resting on the passenger seat beside the old brass key from my father's house. Earlier that day, those items had seemed unrelated. Now they represented 2 sides of the same story. One symbolized everything my family had built through decades of honest work. The other contained the evidence that might finally explain why so many people suddenly wanted to take it away. When I returned to Oak Ridge Estates, the sunlight had softened into the warm golden color that always settled over the neighborhood before evening. The same neighbors were still outside, except now they were no longer pretending not to watch. News traveled quickly in communities like this, and my brief trip to the county office had already become the subject of quiet conversations from one driveway to the next. I carried the binder of certified records under one arm and the small cardboard box of my father's carefully preserved documents under the other. Neither looked impressive, but together they held something far more valuable than opinions. They held a timeline. Vanessa was standing near the community entrance speaking with Daniel Pierce when she noticed me walking back toward the house. She smiled politely, although the confidence she displayed earlier had begun to fade around the edges. "I hope you found what you were looking for," she called across the yard. "Not yet," I answered honestly, "but I found enough to know where I should keep looking." I continued past her without slowing down. My father was waiting on the porch swing, exactly where I had left him. He looked at the thick binder and quietly laughed. "That many papers?" he asked. "Enough to keep me busy tonight," I replied. We carried everything inside and spread the documents across the old dining room table where my parents had helped me with homework years before. The afternoon light streamed through the familiar kitchen window, illuminating every envelope, map, certified receipt, meeting notice, and county filing. Rebecca joined us through a video call, while two members of her legal team organized digital copies of every page in real time. We built a single chronological timeline beginning with the first friendly letter my father had received nearly 2 years earlier. Then we added every HOA notice, every board meeting, every county filing, and every development application. Slowly, the gaps between unrelated events disappeared. Certain meetings took place only days before new violation notices arrived. Development proposals advanced shortly after additional pressure appeared against my father's property. None of those facts alone established improper conduct, but together they created a sequence that deserved far closer examination. Rebecca paused on one page and enlarged a scanned signature. "Ethan," she said carefully, "look at the date on this redevelopment consultation agreement." I compared it with another document from my father's collection. The consultation agreement had been signed several weeks before the HOA began issuing its first wave of repeated notices. That timing immediately stood out. Someone had started planning future changes long before my father understood why so much attention had suddenly focused on his home. My father quietly shook his head. "I never imagined the house mattered that much," he admitted. I looked toward the front window where the old brass mailbox leaned beneath the shade of the oak tree and realized he was wrong. The house mattered because of where it stood, but it also mattered because he had refused to surrender it simply because someone else considered it convenient. My phone buzzed once more. Rebecca had forwarded the entire timeline to a respected land use attorney and requested an emergency review before the evening ended. As I looked around the room, every small detail from earlier that day suddenly carried new meaning. The cedar porch railing, the mailbox, the handwritten dates on every envelope, the preserved certified receipts, and the county records no longer felt like separate pieces of evidence. They had become one complete story, and for the first time since my plane landed, I knew we were no longer reacting to events. We were finally uncovering the truth hidden beneath them. The clock on the kitchen wall showed a few minutes past 6 when Rebecca called again, and this time I recognized the tone in her voice before she spoke a single word. It was the sound of someone who had finally found the missing piece. "Ethan," she said. The land use attorney finished reviewing the timeline. "He agrees there are enough documented inconsistencies to justify immediate preservation requests and formal demands for records before anything else moves forward." I looked around the dining room table one more time. Every document had earned its place. The old envelopes my father refused to throw away. The certified mail receipts Mrs. Brooks had encouraged him to keep. The county filings I had collected that afternoon. Even the video from the neighborhood had become part of the same story. None of them alone explained everything, but together they created a picture nobody could honestly ignore. My father quietly poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one beside me without saying a word. He had always believed difficult problems deserved calm conversations instead of loud reactions. I finally understood why. Patience had given us something emotion never could have delivered. Evidence. Rebecca continued outlining the next steps. Certified requests would be delivered to the association. Public records would be preserved. Independent legal review would begin immediately. If additional information confirmed what the timeline suggested, every decision affecting my father's property could be examined through the proper legal process. Nothing depended upon assumptions anymore. Everything depended upon facts already sitting on the table in front of us. I walked onto the front porch carrying my coffee as the evening air cooled beneath the old oak tree. The brass mailbox still leaned slightly toward the sidewalk, catching the last rays of sunlight exactly the way it had when I was a child waiting for birthday cards from my grandparents. The cedar railing felt smooth beneath my hand after decades of careful maintenance by the man standing beside me. Those details had seemed ordinary for most of my life. Today, they had become reminders that ordinary things are often worth protecting because they represent extraordinary memories. Across the street, several neighbors quietly waved. Mrs. Brooks smiled from her porch before returning inside. Daniel Pierce stepped out onto his driveway, looked toward our house for a long moment, and then lowered his eyes without saying anything. The atmosphere throughout the neighborhood had changed. Earlier, people had watched uncertainty unfold. Now they understood that careful questions were replacing quick assumptions. My father leaned against the porch railing and looked toward the sunset spreading across the Florida sky. "I always believe the truth takes longer to arrive," he said softly. "But when it does, it usually stays." I smiled because those words described him perfectly. Wealth had changed my bank account, my career, and the cities where I spent my time, but it had never improved the lesson he taught me long before any business success. Character is revealed by the choices you make when nobody is forcing you to choose correctly. As the final light disappeared beyond the neighborhood, I slipped the old brass key back into my pocket. I had returned believing I was coming home to defend a house. Instead, I rediscovered something far more valuable. My father had spent a lifetime building a legacy founded on honesty, patience, and quiet dignity, and no amount of paperwork could erase that. Whatever happened next would be decided where it belonged, through facts, lawful process, and the truth that had been patiently waiting to be uncovered all along.